The church is on fire. He staggers out with blistered hands, clutching a locked metal box like a life raft. Sirens wash the stained glass in blue. Arson investigators step past toppled candles and stop. Accelerant patterns run against the grain of any liturgy. Behind the tape, a whisper moves through the crowd. The priest had another name, another life years ago. A corner boy who became a shepherd. The stakes are simple and brutal. Trust or truth? We'll follow the MO, the motive, and the fracture point. And the box he chose over oxygen. What was inside, and why did he protect it? Consider this a composite that could be true. The details are built from standard arson procedure, typical church layouts, and behavioral patterns you've seen before. No invented headlines, no sensational claims, just the mechanics of a mind under heat. We use the fire scene as an X-ray. Arson inquiries do that. They read burn patterns like handwriting. The first clue is always hidden in plain sight. The path the flame preferred. Here, poor patterns in a hallway, a vestry threshold singed in a way candles can't explain, and a stairwell that behaved like a chimney. The accelerant didn't wander, it chose vectors. Moving from the scene to the suspect's profile, the man behind the collar presents clean lines, routine, precision, reliable sermons, punctual hospital visits, bills paid in cash, and a reluctance to be photographed, each item benign alone, suggestive in a stack. The mind, like a locked box, keeps pressure until it leaks at the hinges. The thing is, secrecy has a texture. You can feel it in changed locks and tightened cash policies. Our method is straightforward. We reconstruct a night from camera gaps and witness memory. We compare pour patterns against candle drips. We test ignition hypotheses against timelines and behavior. We paraphrase interviews because language shifts under stress. We keep the focus on motive, not gossip. It comes down to whether the past pulled him back or guilt pushed him forward. Now, let's look at the mechanics of the crime. 3 ignition paths plausibly fit: a deliberate torching to erase something, an accidental transfer during frantic movement with open flame, or third-party sabotage to frame him or force compliance. Each has a behavioral fit and a risk calculus. If he intended to destroy evidence, survival with the box makes little sense, unless control mattered more than escape. If it was accidental, why the accelerant signatures? If sabotage, who benefits from fire that almost killed the leverage? Speaking of motive, the profile suggests a man who managed shame with structure. Prayer as schedule, service as substitution, distance as policy. That's not absolution. That's logistics. If he once ran a distribution network, he knows about custody, redundancy, and control. The box becomes more than metal. It's a node, cache, coded pages, photographs that map spaces. Leverage is a currency. People hold it when they don't trust people. But the real question is why he protected it under active fire. Smoke reduces options to single decisions. He chose the box, not because of greed, because of control. In that moment, he could still decide terms. That is the psychological core. The need to end a threat cleanly, even if the method risks everything else. This is a could-be-true case because the pieces align with known patterns. The accelerant trail, the melted lock near cooler surfaces, the burned forearms from lifting hot metal, the evasive language about stewardship. Each element has been seen in other contexts, other churches, other men. We assemble them here to examine the fracture point where identity fails. Stick around, because the motive is far stranger than the method. 3 years before the fire, he arrived without fanfare. A transfer letter, a quiet handshake, and a promise to stabilize a parish with a leaky roof and a thin budget. He unpacked himself into routine. Morning prayer at 5, ledgers by 6, a walk around the block before the school bell. He knew every hinge in the building by week 2 and every vendor invoice by month 1. Competence reads like calm. People relax around it. But competence can be a form of camouflage. Notice the pattern: control, order, avoidance of spontaneity. Parish festivals ran to the minute. Homilies fit a timed arc: opening story, moral hinge, clean exit. Pastoral visits were logged with clinical precision. He rarely lingered. He didn't accept surprise invitations. When children ran up after Mass, he smiled, knelt to eye level, and steered the chaos toward a predictable game of blessings and high fives. He managed affection the way you manage traffic: flow without collision. At night, if a pipe rattled, he was already in the basement with a wrench before anyone called. If a door jammed, he planed it himself. He slept often in the rectory office, not the bedroom. The office had locked drawers, a view of the lot, and a wall clock that clicked every second. Rhythm kept him steady. The mind as a locked box doesn't stay sealed by accident. It needs an operator who checks the bolts. He moved money like a man who didn't trust banks. Repairs were cash jobs. Receipts existed, but he kept duplicates and coded notes. Vendors learned to bring paper copies. The safe changed combinations twice in 1 quarter. When the diocese offered an automatic deposit system, he paused. "Stewardship prefers manual oversight," he said. "That's a philosophy in a tell. Manual is control. Automated is surrender." He preferred to count. Photographs were another signal. Parish bulletins featured choir kids and casseroles, but he dodged the camera. If a lens swung his way, he turned to the side. When a reporter wanted a profile on the church's neighborhood outreach, he insisted the director speak instead. "It's about the work, not the worker." True, and also a way to keep a record thin: privacy, scaled into policy. Micro stories reveal the person. One night, a volunteer found him gluing hymnals at 1 a.m. He said binding calmed him. Another time, he left an unmarked envelope with cash for a family after a house fire, no note attached. He kept a list of widows' birthdays, but not on a phone, on a small card behind his ID. He disliked digital trails. When a parishioner offered to set up a photo wall of community memories, he gently deferred for months, citing budget. Eventually, it became a bulletin board of handwritten messages. Sentiment without imagery. Memory without faces. He never spoke about his life before seminary in detail. When pressed, he had a set of phrases: long road, got help, God's patience, no dates, no cities. People accepted the distance because the present tense was generous. He visited the sick at odd hours. He returned lost wallets with everything inside. He delivered food without ringing the bell. The kindness was real. The boundary was too. Look at his sermons. They were practical. Less about miracles, more about maintenance. Habits as scaffolding, prayer as repetition that reshapes the day. He used metaphors of craft, sanding rough edges, laying foundations, tightening bolts. He spoke to men who fixed cars and women who ran kitchens, to teenagers who clocked in at grocery stores. He respected process. He rarely cried. He rarely laughed. Emotion was contained. You felt it, filtered. Control has a cost. When the music minister's spouse suggested a spontaneous worship night, he rerouted it into a guided evening of reflection with a printed schedule. When the youth group wanted a camping trip, he insisted on a day hike with a precise checklist. He wasn't killing joy. He was minimizing variables. The past teaches you that variables get you hurt. Cash-only repairs stacked practical benefits: less paperwork, faster work, friendly rates, but it also created opaque flows. He locked receipts in a metal drawer and reconciled them by hand. No one suspected malice. They admired diligence. During the holidays, anonymous donations increased. He routed them himself, thanked no one publicly, and filed nothing more than totals. He said, "People give differently when no one's watching." He meant it. He also needed it untraceable. He distrusted phones. He answered texts with, "Call me." He called from the rectory landline, even to parish staff. When an assistant tried to move everything onto a shared cloud drive, he approved, then printed the files and kept them in color-coded binders. The cloud is a sky. Binders are weight. Weight is control. 3 years earlier, the first hint of the old network appeared as a routine test. A guy waited by the side door after evening prayer. Not a parishioner. Clean shoes, cheap jacket, eyes flicking corners. He asked for directions to the food pantry, though the sign was 10 feet away. He thanked the priest too long. Names weren't exchanged, but he left a single folded page on the donation table, blank, except for a tiny mark in one corner, the kind of mark you only notice if you count edges and angles. The priest removed it calmly, folded it again, and slipped it into his pocket. The next day, he changed the locks, citing a misplaced master key. He added a motion sensor in the side corridor and a camera that didn't cover the whole angle. He called it a deterrent. He started sleeping in the office again. He told the staff, "We're tightening stewardship." That's how the old world knocks, not with threats, but with patterns you recognize. He recognized this one and returned to what he knew: structure, vigilance, and the quiet hope that order could outpace memory. Now let's look at the mechanics of the past without glamour. He wasn't a kingpin. He operated at mid-level, the hinge between wholesale and street. The MO was simple: small footprint, predictable routes, minimal noise. 3 runners at most, never together, never paid in product. He avoided substances entirely. Sobriety preserved control. Control preserved distance. He built a network like a parish schedule: fixed times, fixed places, fixed signals. Meetings happened near loud machinery, laundromats, bus depots, under rail lines, where microphones fail and memory blurs. Hand-to-hand exchanges were rare. He preferred dead drops in public spaces masked by normal behavior. A grocery cart with a broken wheel. A library return bin at closing. Boredom becomes camouflage if you commit to it. His talent was logistics. He tracked inventory in his head like Sunday collections, ledger-like memory reinforced by ritual. He repeated lists while walking, synced quantities to psalm numbers, and used the day's readings as mnemonic anchors. If you think that's theatrical, consider the psychology. The mind prefers familiar scaffolding: scripture in public, codes in private. He kept a slim paper ledger, not obvious, not digital, small enough to pass as a pocket devotional. In the margins, he wrote phrases that matched psalms. "Deliver me," next to a total. "Number my days," next to a date. If seized, it looked pious. If read by him, it was arithmetic. He tested loyalty quietly. Runners never advanced without passing simple integrity traps: a fake short, a late drop, a missed call. He watched their corrections, not their excuses. Those who raged were gone. Those who fixed the error stayed until the next test. Violence wasn't his language. He outsourced intimidation through a contact who knew how to freeze a situation without blood. A car door dented, a rumor planted, a look that changed choices. Emotional detachment functioned as management. He didn't yell. He adjusted supply. Scarcity does the talking. Cash discipline sat at the center. He broke larger payments into smaller, predictable envelopes. He never carried more than a day's flow. He rotated routes by season and mapped law, enforcement patterns by watching traffic stops rather than headlines. If a corner heated, he iced it for weeks. Patience is profit. He didn't chase spikes. He avoided the very thing that later made him credible at a parish meeting: big gestures. He kept secrets in layers. The outer layer was routine, everyone could see: early mornings, mundane errands, the same coffee stand. The middle layer was operational: calls from pay-as-you-go phones, rotated monthly, with numbers written on matchbooks that burned clean. The core layer lived in paper. Those coded psalms, those ledger phrases, a thin key tucked under a drawer liner. He believed steel and paper were honest. People weren't. Why did he leave? The story turns on 3 points. First, a near miss. Bad intel sent a runner to the wrong stairwell at the wrong hour. Police didn't arrest, they noted faces. Surveillance didn't grab him, it brushed him. The scrape rattled something. Second, a child witness, small, silent, standing in a doorway at dawn, watching a handoff that looked like nothing and everything. He saw himself reflected in eyes that measured risk without understanding it. That image lodged like shrapnel. Third, a funeral close enough to touch, not his runner, someone's cousin. One of those not connected deaths that still connects. He framed it as a ledger error. He was wrong on timing, wrong on trust, wrong on the idea that distance absolves causation. The mind tends to correct patterns that hurt it. He started auditing his life. Everything changed when he reframed survival as penance. The exit wasn't cinematic. He phased down supply, closed tabs, sent runners to other hands with warnings about heat. He paid out what he called closing costs, severance disguised as courtesy, and returned 2 envelopes that weren't his. He cut phones. He burned matchbooks. He emptied the pocket devotional into a basin and watched ink lift, letters running like creek water. Not confession, control. Seminary didn't arrive as salvation. It arrived as structure. If you understand reinforcement, you understand this pivot. He replaced one ritual with another. Morning prayer substituted for morning counts. Study hours mirrored route planning. Silence replaced operational security with similar outcomes. Fewer variables, fewer tells. He took to Scripture not as a mystic, but as a mechanic. The text offered rules. The calendar offered cadence. He could hide inside compliance and call it conversion. It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth. He brought habits forward. He sat with the quiet ones and watched room dynamics. He mapped who spoke, who listened, who mediated. He volunteered for inventory tasks and quickly learned church finances quirks, restricted funds, discretionary accounts, cash-heavy festivals, old safes with lazy combinations. He made friends with the person who cut keys and the person who fixed boilers. In a parish, facilities are confessionals of a different kind. Pipes tell you where neglect lives. Doors tell you where fear lives. Money tells you where trust failed. Control remained currency. He pledged it to God and still spent it daily. The difference was the story he told himself about its purpose. Not power, prevention, not profit, protection. The old network ghosted him for a while, but ghosts don't vanish. They wait for a gap, and control always leaves one. Redemption for him wasn't a feeling. It was a schedule. Morning office at 5 wasn't about ecstasy. It was stimulus control. If he woke before the urge to check locks, the prayer took the slot and occupied the hands. Beads replaced matchbooks. The cadence of psalms replaced inventory counts. Same neural groove. New content. He designed days to reduce friction. Tasks stacked in a sequence that left no gaps for rumination. Breakfast with a book. A walk mapped to precisely 30 minutes. Calls returned in batches from the landline. Visits arranged in clusters by neighborhood. The thing is, rigidity gave him calm because it produced predictability. Predictability gave him distance from the past. He swapped rewards. Where risk had delivered a quick jolt, profit, mastery, a clean handoff, service offered quieter returns. He chased those instead. Fix a furnace for a widow, feel the relief roll off her shoulders, deliver groceries, watch posture change. The brain still registered a hit, just slower. He leaned into repetition because repetition builds grooves, and grooves can steer a life if you keep them aligned. He told his story as testimony, never confession. Testimony is curated. Confession is exposure. In small groups, he would say, God can repurpose any tool. He was the tool in that sentence, not the author of harm. He avoided dates, specifics, victims. He framed the past as a single storm, not a climate. People applauded the arc. He reinforced it by serving more and speaking less. He built community through consistency, not intimacy. He knew names, jobs. The week a father started nights, the month a mother took on a second shift. He knew who sat near exits and who avoided eye contact. He stood where he could see the whole nave during Mass. He was present, but never fully reachable. Boundaries were pastoral and protective. They also kept him from being known. He managed urges like a mechanic addresses leaks, monitor pressure, tighten seals, redirect flow. When anxiety rose, he repaired something physical. When memory intruded, he wrote a homily outline with bullet points and timestamps. He carried a pocket card with 3 anchors: breathe, list, act. He didn't pray for erasure. He prayed for sequence. The unresolved debt sat off the books, maybe financial, an envelope that never balanced, maybe existential, the belief that he owed the world a perfect ledger to counter the old one. That thought hummed beneath the hymns. It translated into overwork. He punished himself with completeness, no task. Half finished, no call unanswered. Exhaustion passed for devotion until the body sent invoices. Stress tests arrived quietly. A parishioner pressed him to accept a public award. He declined and redirected it to the food pantry. The diocese proposed a fundraising gala. He insisted on a modest appeal. He told himself it was humility. It was also risk management. Events invite cameras and questions. He chose plain forms because they hid him. He created redundancies just in case. 2 copies of keys in separate envelopes with separate labels. A backup flashlight in every closet. A binder that listed breaker locations and shut-off valves, updated quarterly. He taught volunteers to run fire drills during weekday mornings when no one watched. He called it safety culture. It was also a way to keep chaos at bay. He practiced refusal. Old contacts sometimes ghost through the present as random numbers, wrong addresses, an unfamiliar face at the back pew. He trained himself to default to no. No to late-night door knocks. No to messages that asked for quick favors with vague reasons. He rehearsed scripts. We have a process. Please contact the office during business hours. Practice his armor when adrenaline wants to say yes. His prayer life looked dry on the surface. Few tears, no elaborate devotions. He focused on short petitions. Keep me steady. Guard my tongue. Grant clean motives. He knew the gap between intent and method. He tried to narrow it by restricting method to transparent actions. Cash counted in pairs with a witness. Checks copied and logged. Donations noted by category. Even so, his hands wanted to hold the flow. Community read the routine as reliability. They leaned on him accordingly. He became the person who always answered and never faltered. The role reinforced the structure, which reinforced the role. That loop can look like sanctity. It can also hide compulsion. When rest days came, he found reasons to skip them. Emergencies don't keep calendars, he'd say. True, also convenient. Then, the first contact from the past found the seam. The message was simple. We need one favor. He told himself boundaries would hold. He told himself that helping once prevented larger harm. He told himself the parish required his protection. Rationalization works best when it uses familiar words. Stewardship, safety, prudence. Underneath, the need to decide terms stirred awake. The profile is clear. Redemption as routine can sustain a man like him for years. But if the routine is built to contain guilt rather than process it, pressure accumulates. Intrusive thought, ritual action, brief relief, rebound. The loop tightens. When leverage arrives, he defaults to logistics, not disclosure. So when the favor asked him to move a box, he reached for a calendar, not a confessor. He believed control could finish what repentance started. It couldn't. The call came on the landline during the afternoon lull, when the building hummed with low noise, and his calendar had a thin seam of white. A voice he didn't recognize used a cadence he did, short, neutral, a courtesy that kept distance. The request was simple. A donation box would arrive after evening prayer. He was to place it in the vestry safe until pickup. No signatures, no acknowledgments. The phrase, "for the pantry," floated like cover. He asked routine questions. From whom? For what? Why now? Each reply matched the rhythm of a former life. A friend of the parish. You'll know it when you see it. It won't wait. The mind as a locked box rattles when old keys scrape the brass. He said yes before he thought no, and immediately labeled it stewardship in his head. Leverage arrived first as implication, not threat. The caller mentioned, almost as an aside, a ledger from years ago, a small book that might sit poorly with diocesan leadership or anyone else who cared about the integrity of donations. No accusation, just potential visibility. He felt heat without flame. The psychology is clean, suggest exposure, then offer a task that promises containment. If he complied, perhaps the old pages stayed in the dark. He told himself a familiar story. Protect the parish. Accept a single burden. Ensure nothing dangerous enters the open stream of giving. He could control custody. He would not move money. He would not condone product. He'd be a temporary wall. That framing let him step around his own rules without admitting he'd done it. The box arrived with timing that tested him. After evening prayer, as volunteers stacked chairs and the school janitor rattled a cart down the hall, a man in a cap set a metal case on the donation table. No eye contact. 2 words. For you. Then gone. The weight told him more than the eye. Heavy, off-center, the way packed cash shifts. The handle bit his fingers. He walked the long way to the vestry, bypassing sight lines. He told himself he was preventing concern among parishioners. He told himself moving the box quietly avoided gossip. He slid it into the safe and paused. The click sounded like a pact. He breathed, then rechecked door bolts, then returned to the hall with the same face he wore for hospital visits, calm, neutral, unreadable. That night, alone, he opened the safe. Rationalization needs a ritual. He laid a towel on the desk, set the box down as if preparing a chalice, and examined the lock. It wasn't complex, but tampering would show. He didn't force it. He cataloged the exterior. Fire-resistant steel, scuffed corners, a faint chemical tang trapped in seams. He logged it on a private card as pantry donation, hold. Then he slid the card behind his ID. The next day, the same voice called. Pickup delayed. He felt a pressure change. Delays increase risk. Risk demands description. He asked direct questions. The tone shifted just enough. A name was stated, his old one, then softened with, "Relax, Father." That was the leverage, not law. Identity. He realized too late how cleanly he'd been handled. He considered disclosure. He pictured walking to the finance chair with the box and an explanation constructed from duty. But disclosure would shatter the routine that kept him steady. It would multiply variables. It would invite the question he feared most. Why did you accept it? He needed an answer that preserved the narrative he'd built, and he didn't have one that matched policy. Control offered a quicker path. Keep it contained, then return it. End the pressure. On the 3rd day, pickup shifted again. He opened the safe and lifted the box to assess heat, as if weight and temperature could tell him something new. He heard a faint clink inside, metal touching glass, not pills loose, bottles. The sick familiarity ran up his arms. He set it down and closed the safe. He didn't call the police. He didn't call the diocese. He called the unknown number and left a message he thought sounded stern. This is a church. Collect your property today. Do not return. He thought that line reclaimed ground. It only confirmed he was holding. His language shifted at staff meetings. Stewardship appeared more. Control, less. He tightened cash policies that were already tight. He installed an extra lock on the vestry door and moved 2 cameras by a foot, creating coverage that curiously left a corridor seam. The behavior fit a familiar MO. Reduce angles of approach you can't see, even as you carve a hidden path for your own movement. He told himself he was preventing larger harm. No money would cross the parish threshold into circulation. No pills would touch hands if he managed the timeline. He would end it without scandal. He would do the wrong thing the right way, for the right reason. That is the blind spot. Intent doesn't sanitize method. Method creates outcomes. Then a new message arrived, sliding under the rectory door inside a church bulletin he didn't print. A photograph of the metal box sitting beside the sanctuary rail, time-stamped from a week prior, impossible if accurate. A note below, "Nice place to keep history." He checked the sanctuary camera logs. That angle didn't exist. Panic didn't show on his face, but it narrowed his choices. He convinced himself the only way to stop the game was to hold the piece tighter. He moved the box to a different safe overnight, then moved it back at dawn, telling himself he was testing whether he was being watched. He wasn't thinking about arson, he was thinking about leverage. He decided quietly to catalog the contents soon, not to expose them, but to build counterweight. Control loves documentation when it thinks it can out-argue chaos. That decision bent the week toward fire. Evening service ended at 7:42. The dismissal hymn ran short. The cantor cut the final refrain when a child began to cry near the side aisle. Small variables like that shift minutes. He watched the flow leave the nave, thanked 2 volunteers, and locked the main doors at 7:51, early, but not unprecedented on a weeknight. He kept keys in his left pocket, box card in his right, and a list of tasks in his head. At 7:55, he crossed to the sacristy. The vestry safe sat behind the inner door, flush to a plaster wall that had never been fully rewired. He checked the latch, then the alarm panel. In the side corridor, a motion sensor camera covered the first 20 feet. A small dead zone, a foot or two, remained near the utility closet, an artifact of old angles and cautious installation. He knew it. He had designed it. CCTV gaps are often boring. Sensors wake late, low light confuses pixels, a moth flutters near the lens and triggers a ghost. Here, we have exactly 3 blinks between 7:56 and 8:03, each under 10 seconds, each in that corridor seam. Audio, however, didn't sleep. A mic near the sacristy door captured small sounds, a metal object set down, a keyring clicked twice, and then a soft, dry whisper. 2 voices, one familiar, one not. The words don't carry. The cadence does. Polite hostility. The grammar of old business. A parishioner leaving late with a stroller later reported hearing someone talking too close to the wood. That likely means the sacristy door, which swells at the hinge in summer. Her timeline puts the whisper at 7:59. She didn't see faces. She didn't see hands. She remembers the smell of incense fading and a colder air from the corridor, as if an outer door had breathed in. Accelerant traces start where they shouldn't. A light, linear pattern along the hallway baseboard, turning at the vestry threshold, then skipping down 2 steps toward the basement archive stairwell. This isn't candle behavior. Wax drips. It doesn't pour a line. The pour is thin enough to be deliberate, thick enough to carry flame if helped. The lab will later show petroleum distillates inconsistent with church supplies. Someone introduced a foreign fuel. At 8:01, the rectory landline receives a call from an unknown number. The handset doesn't move. He's still in the church. At 8:02, his mobile, rarely used, pings a tower that covers the rectory and nave. He doesn't pick up. The call dies at 8:03. Silence can be a move. If the caller is pressure, ignoring it asserts control. It also buys time. We chart movements next. At 8:04, the side camera wakes to catch a shoulder crossing the seam. The fabric is dark, the motion compact. He moves like a man unconcerned about being seen by the machine he installed. That's important. Fear of cameras looks different than familiarity with their blind spots. The first open flame appears at 8:06, not visually but by effect. Heat detectors in the nave register a slight rise, then plateau. That suggests ignition in a small enclosed area where smoke initially pools. Think vestry threshold or the stairwell mouth. An usher's jacket stored too close to a candle? Not here. Banners and pews are untouched at this point. The burn wants corridors. At 8:07, a noise in the audio track, the hard clink of steel on tile. The box. He lifts it from the safe or sets it down after opening the safe. Sequence unclear, but either way, the sound is a weight with edges. At 8:08, the mic catches a cough, then the scrape of a chair leg. He's not alone. The second voice says 3 syllables. Could be a name, could be too late. Witness testimony matters, even when memory is soft. A neighbor walking a dog sees a man leave the side entrance at 8:09, head down, cap low. He moves quickly, not in panic. The neighbor notes the posture, the way a person looks when they've decided to be done. The neighbor doesn't register a fire, not yet. Flashover timing helps us bracket choices. The corridor accelerant yields a slithering flame, not a roar. It creeps toward the stairwell where old hymnals and cardboard boxes wait like a gift to combustion. The portable heater installed weeks prior rests near a tangle of extension cords, a hazard cocktail we flagged earlier. At 8:10, the heater's plastic shroud softens. That doesn't mean it starts the fire. It means it becomes a multiplier once heat arrives. At 8:11, he makes a call from the landline. We don't have the content, only the timestamp and duration, 31 seconds. Emergency services aren't dialed until 8:13 by a different caller, a volunteer outside, seeing smoke now pushing at stained glass in small breaths. The 811 call could be to the unknown number. It could be to a staff member. Behaviorally, a brief controlled call suggests a final attempt to assert terms. Pick it up now, or it's over. When the volunteer calls 911 at 8:13, the dispatcher logs, "Smoke in church, people inside unclear." Sirens roll at 8:15. Between 8:12 and 8:16, smoke layer forms along the nave ceiling, then thickens and descends. The aisle behaves like a wick because of airflow from a door cracked at the vestibule. He knows to crawl. Burn marks at knee height later confirm lowered posture along the side aisle. At 8:16, a camera on the exterior catches him exiting the main door, then turning back in. He doesn't carry the box yet. He calls out once, short, sharp, the way you direct a lost person to an exit. 2 parishioners in the vestibule later confirm he herded them outside with efficient, almost cold gestures. No embraces, no explanations. Triage. He returns at 8:17 toward the vestry, not the nave. Optics against him. Psychology consistent with his profile. Remove leverage, stop the chain. A crash at 8:18, wood failing near the basement stairwell. Heat pushes through the corridor now, gulping oxygen from every crack. The accelerant line does its quiet work. At 8:19, he emerges with the box, arms wrapped in what looks like a folded coat. The metal still burns him. Forearm patterns will show contact arcs later. At 8:20, firefighters take the door. They find him 3 steps from the threshold, collapsing sideways to shield the box, then relinquishing it only when ordered. He murmurs something not about pain. It can't leave. Control, intact, even as the building glows. The timeline closes with foam, glass, and a box that refused to burn because steel did its honest work. People didn't. Now, let's look at the mechanics of the crime. 3 ignition paths fit the physical and behavioral evidence. Each requires motive, opportunity, and a tolerance for risk. The profile sits beside the pour patterns. We weigh both. Scenario A. Intentional torching to erase the box. The MO is simple. Lay a thin accelerant line along the corridor baseboard, bend it at the vestry threshold to create a heat gate, and drip down toward the basement where old paper guarantees spread. A striker or butane wand would do it. You light where you can retreat without smoke collapse, then let airflow do the rest. The pour we see is too tidy for panic, too linear for candle spill. The benefit is erasure, papers, residue, fingerprints, tapes, gone under plausible disaster. The problem is survival. If you plan to burn evidence, why leave with the box? Why not crack it open, empty contents into the flame, and walk out with clean hands? The counter is psychological. If control is the motive, you don't trust fire to edit your story. You keep custody to the end. He lifts the box while the building burns because steel guarding secrets feels safer than ash that anyone can interpret. It's control disguised as cleanup. The risk is catastrophic optics, accelerant present, a box in hand, burns on forearms. Yet, some offenders tolerate immediate suspicion to protect long-term leverage. If the contents implicate others who can retaliate, preserving the node matters more than narrative. Scenario B: accidental ignition via candle transfer during stress handling. Churches create small fires every day. Votive racks, processional tapers, sacristy candles staged on trays. Under stress, a sleeve brushes a flame, wax drips, and smolder starts in fibrous materials you don't notice. Here's the issue. Candle transfer leaves scatter, wax beads, scorched linen, irregular soot flowers. Our traces aren't that. We have a directed line, a turn at the threshold, a descent along steps. Accidents don't draft a map. Could stress mimic deliberation? In rare cases, yes. If a handler uses a solvent to clean a spill and then introduces flame. But the lab profile points to petroleum distillates foreign to church supplies. And the timing argues intent. Ignition near 8:06 in a corridor without active candles. Still, the human factor keeps this scenario on the board. If he opened the box earlier, found volatile containers inside, and handled them near a heater or frayed cord, a small ignition could sprint along a previously contaminated surface. It would look deliberate after the fact. The behavioral fit is weaker. His pattern is control. Control avoids open flames near unknown chemicals. If he slipped, it's because he believed the room obeyed his rules. That's not common accident. That's overconfidence. Scenario C: third-party sabotage to frame him or force compliance. The technique is known. Introduce a thin accelerant line in a low-traffic corridor during a blind camera scene. Light where heat will later implicate the target's movements, and time the ignition to coincide with the target's predictable presence. A pressure actor benefits if the priest is discredited or bound tighter by scandal. The neighbor's sighting of a quick exit at 8:09, cap low, posture clean, supports a second presence. The whispered cadence suggests negotiation, not solo mutter. The accelerant brand matching non-parish sources helps. So does the photo of the box near the sanctuary rail days prior, a taunt that implies access. If the network wanted leverage, fire is an extreme lever. But consider the cost. Fire invites investigators, insurance adjusters, diocesan scrutiny. Networks hate paperwork. Unless the goal is to pin the accelerant on him and force a desperate bargain, keep quiet, or we deliver the narrative to the public. Sabotage becomes a test. Will he burn for the box or surrender it? He chose to carry it out. That choice suits their prediction model. They get both outcomes, damage and a compromised target. Now, evidence waits. Poor patterns versus drip lines favor A or C. Flashover timing versus smoke layer formation points to a staged corridor burn, not a random nave event. The melted lock anomaly, steel softened near cooler surroundings, suggests localized preheating at the box's prior position. That helps A and C again. Either he prepped a burnout zone to fake destruction, or saboteurs heated the area to ensure the lock weakened for later tampering. In either case, the lock tells us heat touched intent, not chance. Behavioral fit matters as much as chemistry. Who benefits from fire? Who risks the most with survival? If he lit it, he gambled his vocation to keep custody. If they lit it, they gambled the parish to secure obedience. His survival with the box complicates both. It undercuts the erasure motive in A, but supports the control motive in A. It frustrates C's clean framing, but strengthens C's leverage. Now, he's publicly attached to the box. B remains the least persuasive on balance, but it answers a core trait. He believes he can control small risks. Accidents are what control men make when they overestimate their reach. The profile pushes us toward a hybrid model. Intent intersected with sabotage, or sabotage exploited a pattern he created. Think about this like a combination lock. Each dial is a factor. Accelerant line, camera seam, portable heater, paper fuel load, his need for custody. You can spin any one and get nothing. Align 3 and the safe clicks. The mind is a locked box. Under heat, contents press outward. The fire reads like a negotiation that failed and a contingency plan. That worked too well. So, which path leads? The lab can't answer motive. The timeline can't weigh conscience. But the real question is simpler. What decision would a man who worships control make when cornered? He would choose the method that keeps the most options in his hands. That means he doesn't trust accidents. He doesn't trust others. He trusts steel. And steel walked out with him. Start with the object itself. Fire-blackened steel, corners blistered, handle heat-warped, but intact. When investigators opened it under chain of custody, the interior was dry, cool, almost smug in its survival. That tells you premeditated protection. Someone trusted the box to outlast chaos. He trusted steel more than people. In his world, steel doesn't change its story when frightened. Inside, order. Cash bands in modest denominations, not flashy, wrapped in paper labeled with single letters that don't match parish categories. Coded pages, thin, precise handwriting that pairs dates with short phrases. Deliver me. The measure. Count my days. Those match the old mnemonic palette. Not scripture quoted to inspire, scripture repurposed to index. Not theft at scale, but flows that bleed integrity. And tucked into a side sleeve, photographs of parish spaces from angles the public never sees, below the altar rail, behind the tabernacle stand, the sacristy door jamb where a Primarch would hide beneath paint. Surveillance without people. Geography, not faces. Why protect it? Leverage works both ways. In his mind, the box was a bargaining chip against anyone who tried to own him and a shield against the institution that might discard him. If old contacts forced a task, the ledger inside could threaten exposure. If the diocese challenged his stewardship, the cash and codes could be framed as documentation proving he kept harm contained. It's an ugly calculus. Keep the node, keep options. Lose the node, lose narrative. For a control mind, custody equals life. Consider the psychology. He believed in physical custody the way some believe in oaths. Steel meant certainty. Paper meant memory outside the brain. He constructed a portable fortress because human agreements had failed him on the street and in himself. The mind as a locked box finds comfort in a literal one. If you can hold it, you can end it, when you decide. That belief is the hinge where redemption bent back toward logistics. Ethically, the paradox is stark. He told himself he was protecting the flock by securing the poison away from circulation. But he did it inside their sanctuary, inside their air. He risked them to shield them. That's guardianship as self-authorization. He chose method over transparency because method was his native language. He couldn't see that the act of containment was itself contamination. Money labeled for pantry became mixed with money from pressure. Codes built to index mercy mirrored codes built to move product. Intent doesn't. Bleach process. The truth was worse. He wasn't relapsing into dealing. He was integrating tools across identities, trusting outcomes to wash method clean. Now, about those photographs. They aren't trophies. They are maps. Each image marks a choke point, a place where leverage could be staged, a rail that hides a package, a hinge that strains under forced entry, a duct whose grill can swallow a slim envelope. Whoever shot them, him or a watcher, understands operational pressure. If he shot them, he was cataloging risk to counter future threats. If they did, they were demonstrating reach. Either way, the box contains a conversation between control and intrusion. That's why he ran toward it under heat. He saw not cache and code, but a dialogue he needed to dictate. The melted lock anomaly squares here. Testing showed localized preheating at the box's former position, enough to soften a cheap lock without driving nearby surfaces to the same state. That suggests someone applied targeted heat earlier or staged the box near a subtle heat source long enough to weaken security. Both point to intentionality around the object, not random fire behavior. The box wasn't incidental, it was the axis. Think about leverage as currency. In his past, secrets move people better than force. A rumor placed right could empty a corner. A withheld payment could reorder loyalty. The box translates that economy into clerical life. Codes equal control. Cash equals favor. Photos equal reach. In a parish, the soft power is trust. The hard power is information. He amassed the latter to defend the former. That's the story he told himself. But leverage creates its own gravity. Once you stock it, you orbit it. Now, the question you care about: why not destroy it once he saw the fire? Because destruction would hand authorship to the blaze. Fire eats without discriminating. Ash is democratic. He needed a controlled ending, one where he chose what survived and what didn't. Carrying the box through smoke preserved authorship. It also burned his arms and his standing. He accepted those costs because they were calculable. Public suspicion is survivable if you still hold terms. The box forces a moral audit. Protecting people by hoarding power is exploitation dressed as stewardship. Yet the motives weren't greed. He didn't skim for comfort. He hoarded for competence, the painful belief that he alone could keep the board steady. That belief destroyed the board. The sanctuary became a vault. The vault became a fuse. The box became both confessional and crime scene, a locked mind under heat, finally opened not by contrition, but by a warrant. Across town, unaware of how tight the timeline really was, people tried to make sense of him by describing routines. Parish staff first. The office manager sat with a stack of signed deposit slips and said, "He started calling the safe a stewardship hub." The phrase landed like policy, then hardened into practice. New locks, extra steps, 2 signatures for petty cash. She liked the order but noticed a shift. He'd stand in the doorway while I counted, not hovering, guarding. The facility's lid talked hardware. He swapped out hinges that weren't squeaking yet. Preventive maintenance on paper. In his voice, a question. He kept saying, "Friction makes failure." The man respected that logic. He also remembered the week the cameras moved. He nudged the side corridor cam, said glare. It did fix glare, left a blind inch. He shrugged. Probably nothing, but it sticks. A choir parent described him in small kindnesses. He'd show up with throat lozenges before a concert and never say who asked. Gratitude ran through her words, but unease threaded the edges. Then the night meetings started again. Late visitors. He called them stewardship consults. I heard voices, then silence, then the door click. It felt tight. Volunteers mentioned language drift. He replaced generosity with custody, donation with intake. A subtle pivot from relationship to logistics. One usher said, "He was gentler at funerals and harder at finance." Another offered a micro-story: a snowstorm, an empty church, and the priest sweeping the entire nave alone at midnight. He said, "Leaving disorder invites trouble." The usher had nodded then. Now he wasn't sure what trouble meant. Parishioners described the night of the fire in clipped phrases. He didn't panic. He pointed and we walked. He didn't touch us, just moved us. The effect was competence under pressure. The after effect was suspicion. "Why go back for a box?" a teacher asked. "Why not hymnals, the chalice?" The question held no malice. It held arithmetic. Values weighed. We turned to the investigator's approach. Start benign, build rapport. Let the subject occupy familiar ground. They asked about the parish budget, the food pantry intake process, the routine for closing buildings. He answered crisply. Disbursements are logged by category. Cash counts require dual control. Doors are secured in 2 passes. His diction stayed institutional, as if he could make the interview a policy review. They shifted to timeline compression. At 7:51, you locked the main doors. Who remained inside? He supplied volunteers' names and tasks, then rerouted to a maintenance note about a sticky latch. At 7:59, a witness heard voices by the sacristy. He responded with a statement about reminding people not to linger near wood paneling with tapers. Accurate, adjacent, not direct. Then the box. "When did it arrive?" He said, "A donation placed without a return address." "When?" "After evening prayer." "Which day?" "Tuesday." Staff calendars suggested Monday, a small fracture. The office manager later checked her message log. A voicemail from a delivery friend sat under Monday's date. The contradiction widened the gap. The interviewers made the question smaller. "Where did you first set it down?" He answered with priestly language. "It belonged in custody." "Where?" "The vestry safe, pending categorization." He didn't say he carried it through the corridor seam. He didn't admit he knew the cam angle. He stayed with stewardship. He stayed away from intent. They introduced the accelerant gently. "We found petroleum traces along the baseboard." He paused, then chose abstraction. "People sometimes bring candles and oils." They framed the lab profile without brands. "This isn't church stock." He breathed once, slow. "That's concerning." Not outraged, not surprised. Concern placed him as caretaker, not actor. Now, the parish finance chair, careful by nature, recalled a recent change. He had begun requiring her to sign off on envelope counts she hadn't watched. He said it was redundant safety. She accepted the logic. Redundancy is comfort. But it skipped a step. "I trust, but I verify," he often said. The chair realized verification had gotten delegated to belief. An elderly usher added a detail the timeline couldn't capture: tonality. When he said, "We're tightening stewardship," his jaw set. It wasn't anger. It was resolve that blends with fear in a mind like his. Control under stress becomes compression. People feel it without naming it. Finally, the priest's voice inside a recorded interview, paraphrased here to respect process. He framed every answer in duty. "My role is to protect the parish. My obligation is custody. My priority is safety." When pressed on intent, why accept an unlogged box? Why move it alone? Why return for it under smoke? He stepped sideways. "I am responsible for what is on this property." He didn't say why it was there. He didn't say who asked. Subtext matters. He answered motive with duty because intent would reveal history. He avoided dates. He used nouns like shields, stewardship, custody, safety. The investigators noted the evasion without forcing a break. Pressure works better when you let the subject believe control persists. Then they placed the photo on the table, the box near the sanctuary rail, time-stamped prior. He looked at the image, then at the door. A small tell. He wasn't measuring escape. He was measuring reach. The contradiction on arrival day did the work a shouted accusation never could. If the box came Monday, why tell Tuesday? If it sat longer, why not log it? The interview ended on a polite note, but the air changed. He asked to see the chain of custody form. He asked to confirm storage. He asked if the box would remain on site. Control, again, asserting itself as the room tightened. As the door closed behind him, an investigator wrote a single line. He will not admit intent. He will defend stewardship. Which brings us to the next step in the profile, how guilt shifts from penance into compulsion when the story you tell yourself becomes the method you can't stop using. Guilt can govern a life without ever speaking its own name. In him, it started as penance, measured work to balance a ledger he could never show. Over time, method took the place of meaning. He didn't seek forgiveness, he sought completion. If a task ended clean, he felt briefly human. When it didn't, he added another task and another, until the day's silence was packed to the seams. Think about this as a loop. Intrusive thought arrives. You failed them then. Don't fail them now. He answers with ritual action. A checklist, a lock test, a cash count done twice. Relief follows, but it's thin. The thought rebounds. You miss something. He repeats the ritual. The loop tightens. That's compulsion, a behavior once chosen now choosing you. He framed it as stewardship because stewardship sounds moral. The truth was worse. He punished himself with work. He rejected rest as if it were indulgence, not maintenance. He believed only exhaustion made him safe. Sleep postponed choices, wakefulness policed them. The cost was attention. He lost the ability to distinguish urgency from control's appetite. Guilt rerouted his honesty. Testimony, not confession. He told people what guilt would tolerate. I was lost. Now I serve. The past stayed abstract so he could keep the method intact. Confession would force a method change. Disclosure, supervision, shared control. He didn't fear judgment. He feared dependence on someone else's keys. Everything changed when leverage entered the loop. Pressure amplified his need for clean closure. He started seeing problems as boards that could be reset if he performed one decisive act. Deliver the box back, and the network vanishes. Shield the parish, and the debt is paid. In that calculus, risk isn't danger, it's currency. Spend it to end the game. That's the crisis point. Control promises finality it can't actually provide. Past role residue crept in under stress. Logistics returned like muscle memory. Angles, timings, blind seams. He didn't fantasize about product. He fantasized about mastery. He pictured a room that obeyed rules, and he worked to make the room obey. Under pressure, cold calculation rides along with care. He optimized corridors and forgot that other people improvise. Chaos doesn't respect schedules. His blind spot was overconfidence in method. He believed that if he handled custody, motive would shine through. If he held the box without dipping into it, if he labeled it hold, he was still clean. He didn't see that motive and method converge in outcomes. Flames aren't persuaded by intention. Paper doesn't care why it's stacked near a heater. The world doesn't grade effort. It records effects. Consider the letter with the photo. Proof the box had been seen where it shouldn't. That moment should have driven disclosure. Instead, it drove. Documentation. He planned to catalog contents, photograph ledgers, write a cipher key. Counter leverage as sacrament. That's compulsion wearing a collar. It looks prudent. It functions like a ritual to quiet dread. And it concentrates risk into one room because the ritual requires proximity. He translated prayer into pressure management, short petitions mapped onto acute spikes of fear. Guard my tongue became guard my choices. Keep me steady became keep this contained. Prayer lost its interpersonal weight and became self-talk for precision. He didn't ask for help. He asked for performance. That's not trust. That's self-command in a sacred register. Community love fed the loop. Gratitude from the sick relief from the hungry, respect from the practical. It all confirmed the story that he, steward of control, prevented harm. Each thank you turned the dial. If I stop, harm returns. Stop what? Not service, control. He couldn't distinguish anymore. And so every boundary he added felt like love, when some were simply fear in uniform. When the fire came, guilt didn't say dismantle. It said finish. Finish means remove leverage. Remove leverage means carry the box. He believed he owed them an end to pressure, not a confession of process. He chose a decisive act because his profile predicts it. Compulsion always seeks a final ritual, the one that will make the loop stop. Fire pretended to offer that. In the hospital, burned and breathing smoke, he said, "It can't leave this place." That sentence is the loop, spoken plain. The place wasn't the church anymore. It was his control radius. If the box stayed within the orbit he managed, guilt stayed quiet. If it left, the loop would roar. He chose pain over silence rather than surrender authorship. Now, let's pivot to the pattern investigators recognize. When penance becomes compulsion, language hardens, choices narrow, and the subject prefers mechanisms to relationships. He asks about chain of custody, not parish trust. He reviews lock logs, not staff fear. He shifts nouns. Love recedes. Custody expands. That transition marks the moment when redemption's scaffold turns into a cage. Which brings us to the letter that arrived after the interview. One image, one date, a proof the control was never complete. It didn't just taunt him. It exposed the flaw at the core of his method. He'd engineered for order. He'd underestimated other minds, and the mind under heat doesn't forgive miscalculation. Consider who plays this kind of game. Not faces, techniques. The old network doesn't argue. It engineers conditions. Their motive is rarely singular. They want the money back if it's theirs. They want the priest compliant if he's useful. Or they want to test the fence. If the fence holds, they pivot. If it bows, they push until it becomes a gate. Speaking of motive, reclaiming cash is the simplest layer. The bands inside the box weren't ostentatious, but they represented history, open tabs, favors owed, payments held in escrow by memory. Networks run on more than product, they run on accounting. If he left with ledger still echoing, someone might treat the parish as an interest-bearing account. Recovery looks like charity if you print the right label, but the richer motive is binding him to future tasks. Compromise first, then extract. A priest who touches unlogged cash is now a man who needs silence. Silence has a price. The network doesn't need him to move product. They need him to move consent, sign a form, store a parcel, introduce a donor, vouch for a contractor. Small favors that scaffold bigger ones. If he says no later, the past becomes present on their timetable. There's also the test. Network's profile, too. They wanted to know whether the routine he'd built was armor or costume. The drop was simple for a reason. If he called police on day one, armor. If he stored the box and argued stewardship, costume. His pause taught them his pressure points. Control isn't invisible when you're watching cadence and word choice. Pressure methods here are textbook. Anonymous notes dropped with church bulletins he didn't print. Piggyback deliveries that attach to existing flows, so no new pattern blinks on a radar. Tiny favors posed as pastoral tasks. Hold this for the pantry. Sign for this repair. Let our donor use the hall off hours. Each move is deniable in isolation. Together, they create a norm. Then, norm becomes leverage. They apply silent terror because explicit threats invite resistance and documentation. A photo with a timestamp murmurs, "We were in your sanctuary." A voice that knows the old name says, "We can unmask you." Nothing overt. Enough implied. It's the locked box mind's nightmare. Intrusion without a clear hand to grasp. He responds by tightening locks, which confirms to them that he felt it. Operational pressure leans on predictability. He loves schedule. They weaponize it. The box arrives when his volunteers are distracted. Calls land in the afternoon seam. The camera seam isn't exploited by chance. It's exploited because he created it. That's the elegance. They make him complicit in his own vulnerability. If he adjusts angles, they note reflexes. If he moves the box at dawn, they clock dawn. Strategically, their aim bifurcates. Either compromise the parish as an asset, turn the building into a staging ground, the finance office into a laundering gap, or own the priest as an asset so the building can be used when needed without permanent footprints. The second is cleaner. Institutions have auditors. People have habits. He's a habit machine. Now let's look at how they keep the pressure just below panic. They pace the asks, delay pickup, then delay again. Each delay erodes the target's story that this is temporary. He will act to end the discomfort. They predict he'll choose action that preserves control. Catalog the contents. Write a cipher key. Move the box to a different safe. All of that concentrates risk while convincing him he's reducing it. They also seed contradictions to fracture his credibility in advance. The Monday-Tuesday arrival discrepancy isn't random. If they nudge the drop a day earlier than message Tuesday in his ear, they set a trap. When the timeline breaks under questioning, he looks evasive. The more he relies on stewardship language, the more policy sounds like cover. Now, if he tries to expose them, he does so from a weakened position. Operational pressure works best when the target becomes his own disqualifying witness. The photo of the box near the sanctuary rail serves multiple functions. It shows access. We can approach sacred space. It shows proximity. We can place leverage where meaning lives for you. And it shows surveillance. We see what your cameras don't. For a man who measures reach by infrastructure, that image forces a reassessment. Either someone inside helped, or his systems aren't sovereign. Both conclusions shrink his world. If you ask why they risked fire-level scrutiny, consider the calculus. They didn't need a catastrophe. They needed heat. A corridor burn that stays mostly in the spine of the building creates disruption, pulls resources, and pins a narrative to the priest without destroying the asset entirely. If it ran further than planned, that's the risk you accept when using volatility as a tool. Opportunists often prefer edges. Fire is an edge. He tries a counter move, catalog the contents, and create counter leverage. But networks anticipate documentation. They design their pressure so that any record you create incriminates you more than it shields you. Photographs of coded pages look like ownership. A cipher key looks like authorship. Extra locks look like intent to conceal. Now, if he threatens to reveal, he threatens to reveal himself, which brings us to the downstream aim. Either the parish becomes compromised but functioning, a place where favors pass under the scent of soup and hymns, or the priest becomes useful and scared, a man who signs what he's told. Both require an erosion of trust. They applied force at the seam between his testimony and his confession, knowing he would choose method over disclosure. They were right, until the fire made method visible. The thing is, operational pressure doesn't stop with flames. It migrates to where the box goes next: evidence locker, courtroom, rumor chain. If their motive included binding him, the tragedy simply added rope. If their motive included reclaiming cash, the chain of custody blocks them for now, so they pivot to story warfare. And in story warfare, his silence is their weapon. Consider this before we move on. The network didn't need him to love them. They needed him to hate chaos enough to choose them over it. He did, for a week. That was enough to light a match. As the door closed behind him, he made a decision that felt like faith but functioned like procedure. He would catalog the contents, not to expose, to balance the board. If leverage had been weaponized against him, documentation would become his counterweight. Think of it like building a duplicate key to a locked box. If someone else holds the original, you forge a copy and hide it where only you can reach. He cleared the rectory desk, towel down, lamp angled low to avoid window glare. A legal pad divided into 3 columns: currency, code, image. He set a fresh memory card and a camera he hadn't used since a parish photo project stalled. The irony didn't land. He loaded spare batteries as if preparing for a night watch. He numbered envelopes without opening bands, writing amounts he could infer from thickness and typical bundling. Modest stacks, consistent with pressure, designed to implicate without enriching. He photographed each band from 2 angles, corner and face, never capturing serials, telling himself he wasn't owning the money, only recording custody. That distinction mattered to him, and only to him. Then, the ledger pages. Thin paper, dense hand. He shot them flat, then at oblique angles to capture indentation and stroke. He annotated his pad with psalm phrases matched to dates. Deliver me equals distribution. The measure equals intake. Count my days equals intervals. He was correct about the code family. He was wrong about the safety of decoding it alone. The act turned knowledge into evidence of authorship. Next, the photographs of hidden angles, the rail underbelly, the hinge line, the duct. He printed small proofs on a rectory inkjet, clipped them with paper clamps, and added a letter to each back. A for altar, S for sacristy, V for vestry. He told himself he was building a map for security upgrades. He told himself the images would help him argue for funds. He told himself many things. Underneath, control hummed. He wrote a cipher key on a single index card. Simple substitutions, anchored to liturgical dates. First Sunday of a month stood for 1. Feast days carried multipliers. He smiled once, a quick grim acknowledgement that the system pleased the part of him that solved puzzles under pressure. That smile is important. It's the signal of a loop satisfied, briefly. Where to store duplicates? The church, he decided, not the rectory. The church had concrete walls and a basement archive with metal shelves. He convinced himself the sanctuary was a fortress, holy, thick, central. He prepared 2 packets. Packet 1 held photo prints and the cipher card. Packet 2 held a thin handwritten index that summarized amounts and code phrases without raw numbers. He sealed each in a plastic sleeve and wrote "Facilities Schematics" on the front in a hand he used for maintenance binders. He went down to the basement archive after lights out. The portable heater's cord snaked across a pathway he'd meant to tidy. He stepped over. It unlocked a steel cabinet and slid Packet 1 behind a binder labeled Roof Bids Old. Packet 2 went behind boiler inspections. He stacked 2 hymnals on the shelf edge, a habit he used to signal himself where something lived. Chekhov's hymnals. He left believing only he could read the room. The fatal misstep wasn't hiding records. It was concentrating them. He created a single point of failure by placing original leverage and counter-leverage inside the same envelope of risk. 1 building, 1 corridor, 1 fire path. He would have seen it instantly in a different life. He missed it because the church felt like an extension of his body. We all misjudge danger closest to our heart. A second error compounded the first. He assumed heat behaved like an obedient variable. The portable heater had been installed after a pipe burst weeks prior. He'd placed it away from obvious combustibles on a bare patch beside a utility rack. Perfect on paper. In practice, volunteers had shifted boxes after a pantry delivery. Old hymnals, corrugated cartons, a bag of seasonal banners. Combustibles nested near wiring. He'd walked past them a dozen times without seeing hazard because he was looking for intrusion, not ignition. Then, the amplifier move. He drafted a short memo to himself in the facilities binder. Consolidate archives Q3. It meant, well, tidy, purge duplicates, move old boxes to a single aisle for inventory. He began the consolidation immediately, staging piles near the stairwell where airflow later pulled flame. Consolidation saves time in audits. It also feeds fire in corridors. In the days before the blaze, he performed one more ritual that sealed the outcome. He tested the box's lock with localized heat, a hairdryer held close, borrowed from a sacristy drawer, as if mimicking the melted lock anomaly he'd later confront. He told himself he needed to know the box's tolerance in case of emergency. He preheated the area where it sat, softening the lock just enough to shift the metal's memory. That small act wouldn't start a fire. It laid a foundation for a failure that would look like chance. Meanwhile, above ground, he scheduled a meeting with the finance chair to discuss infrastructure upgrades. His notes listed cameras, locks, and, at the bottom, document controls. He intended to propose a new safe for paper records, not donations. The phrasing was careful. The timing was late. He was designing policy around a crisis already in motion. He returned to the basement that night to check his packets. Both were where he left them. He ran a fingertip along the cabinet edge and felt dust break under his nail. He read that as secrecy, not neglect. He turned the heater off, then back on to confirm the thermostat clicked. He did not look up to see the ventilation pattern that would later channel heat like a wick. On the way out, he paused by the stairwell, listening to the building breathe. He believed the church kept him. He did not consider that he had turned it into a vault with a fuse. The human error and the human malice we traced earlier didn't need much spark. He had stacked the fuel himself, alphabetized it, and labeled it safety. Now let's look at the mechanics of the burn inside a sacred geometry. Ventilation writes the fire's first sentence. The cracked vestibule door pulled fresh air low. The high nave ceiling trapped hot gases until the layer thickened, then rolled forward. That created a pressure gradient. The center aisle behaved like a wick, not because of wax, but because airflow sought the easiest path through pew canyons, cloth runners, and varnished edges that love heat. Fuel arranged the grammar. Varnished pews off-gas flammable vapors as temperature rises. Banners add vertical ladders. Paper archives stack horizontal beds. Linen, hymnals, corrugated boxes. Each offers a different ignition temperature and burn rate. Together, they compose a fuel matrix that needs only a line of invitation. The corridor pour served as that line. Once kindled, it crawled along baseboards, found paper near the stair, and stepped down into the archive's breath. Flashover is the pivot where room contents ignite nearly at once because the upper layer radiates back onto every surface. Here, the estimate is minutes, not seconds. Why? The first ignition occurred in a semi-enclosed corridor with limited immediate fuel. Heat built locally, migrated to the stairwell, and only then fed the nave through returning convection. That delay created a window, narrow, real, where decisions mattered. He used that window for triage and for the box. Smoke speaks before flame. Early on, the upper layer was thin, hottest near the vestry junction, cooler above the nave aisle. As the stairwell burned, pyrolysis in the pew varnish accelerated, thickening smoke, lowering the layer. Burn marks at knee height on stone and scuffing on pew ends tell us he crawled, as trained. The body reads smoke faster than the eye. He dropped posture to stay in the breathable slice. The portable heater became a heat amplifier, not a spark. Plastic softened, then failed, exposing wiring that arced under stress. Positioned near paper and textiles from his consolidation, it converted a corridor burn into a room-engulfing threat. This is how small human decisions change fire behavior. Airflow plus arrangement equals force. He had designed for intrusion. He had not designed for thermal pathways. The melted lock anomaly on the box has a straightforward explanation when you map radiant heat. Preheating occurred where the box sat earlier, near a wall that warmed faster due to the corridor line. Steel absorbs and redistributes heat. If the lock used a low-melting alloy, you can soften tumblers without charring adjacent surfaces, especially if a convective eddy bathed that corner. Localized preheat weakens security while leaving the scene looking oddly selective. Intent doesn't need a torch. It can borrow physics. Consider how doors changed the plot. The main doors closed created a piston. The side door cracked allowed intake. The vestry door ajar created a jet, pushing flame tongues along the threshold and licking up casing paint. Flow patterns etched crescents on wood and left clean, ghosting behind plaques where heat couldn't lick. These are the fingerprints of airflow. They point away from an accidental candle arc and toward a guided corridor, burn meeting an eager fuel bed. Thermal layering punishes standers and spares crawlers. Soot deposition at 5 feet is dense, at 2 feet thinner. That gradient tracks survival choices. He knew to keep low. Firefighters later reported modest charring along pew tops, but heavy calcination near the stair mouth. The sanctuary didn't explode, it sighed into flame. That's why parishioners were still movable at first contact. It's also why the return trip carried a heavier price. Each minute collapsed the ceiling layer by inches until the aisle's wick pulled heat directly across his escape line. Why didn't stained glass shatter in a uniform pattern? Because heat load was asymmetric. The corridor and stair became engines. The nave absorbed radiance with lag. Lead came softened in panels nearest the aisle flow, others held. Soot veiling shows an arrowhead pointing sacristy ward. Follow that arrow. You retrace the accelerant's logic. The science brings us to his choice under pressure. He had seconds while flashover staged. Save people or secrets. He split the window, evacuate 2 in the vestibule, then pivot toward the vestry, into the gradient steepening by the breath. That's moral triage under physics. He believed he could outrun the transition between incipient and fully developed fire. For a moment, airflow made him right. Then heat caught him as the stair engine fed the layer. We end with the box's survival. Fire licks at edges, steel shrugs until the inside reaches critical. The interior stayed dry because convective heat didn't dwell long enough to soak through mass. That's premeditated protection meeting a burn profile with distributed, not concentrated residence time. He trusted steel because steel obeys. People, air, and time did not. The building told the story in scorch lines and flow marks. A corridor invited, an archive fed, a sanctuary complied. And in that architecture, his control found its limit. The first choice was immediate and clean. 2 parishioners in the vestibule, one older, one clutching a tote, frozen by the way smoke thinned and thickened like a tide. He took the older woman's elbow, set the tote in the other's hands, and pointed them through the main door in a straight line. No comfort phrases, just a crisp, go. He positioned his body to narrow their options to only exit. That's how control rescues, by removing alternatives. Outside air hit like clarity. He saw the line of smoke along, the nave ceiling, a dark river lowering. And he knew what came next. He could sweep the pews, bang the backs, call names. Or he could pivot to the vestry and end the leverage he believed threatened all of them. He split the window. One more shout across the emptying space. Is anyone there? Then the turn, not to the center aisle, to the corridor. Optics against him. But the profile fits. Remove the lever first, then face the room. Time was running out. The accelerant along the baseboard had turned the corridor into a throat. Heat gathered its words. He dropped to a crouch, then a crawl, forearms forward, one hand feeling wall, the other pressing keys against his palm. The body knows what the mind plans to reach. The safe sat 6 strides beyond the sacristy threshold. He counted them like beads. On the way, a small choice that reveals the hierarchy. He passed the candle trolley an arm's length away. A hand could have toppled it, creating a barrier to slow air. He didn't touch it. Interventions that altered the building felt like chaos. Custody felt like order. He stayed with order, even as the building rewrote the rules. At the vestry, the first pain reported itself, not as fire, but his dryness that rasped the throat into a cough, he didn't answer. He opened the inner door with a shoulder and found the safe by memory more than sight. The box scraped tile, a sound he'd heard hours earlier and now wished didn't echo. He wrapped it in a folded coat he kept for funerals and lifted. The weight moved his center low. He adjusted grip, forearms taking heat through cloth that worked for a moment, then didn't. Moral triage isn't abstract at floor level. It's the math of breath. He could leave the box and gain seconds for a second sweep. He could keep it and spend those seconds on leverage. He had already framed the box as a threat multiplier. Remove it, and future harm diminishes. That was his clean closure fantasy. One decisive act collapses the loop. He chose the future over the present, a dangerous calculus in a room measured by minutes. Back in the corridor, the stairwell's voice grew from whisper to vowel. Heat pushed, paint blistered in curls. He kept low, sliding the box along tile, then hauling when it caught. He didn't speak. Words cost air. He did one thing right in the wrong plan. He stayed oriented, one hand on the wall, one thought on the door. He had trained people to do this in drills he called safety culture. Now, he executed alone. Near the nave threshold, his knee hit a hymn book dropped in an earlier scramble. He flinched, then used it. He shoved the book under the box to glide it a foot at a time over grout lines. Micro-innovations under pressure reveal cognition intact. That matters. He wasn't panicking. He was prioritizing within a flawed frame. A figure moved in the smoke at the nave edge, a volunteer coughing, half-turned. He could have ditched the box and crawled her out. He shouted once, clipped, "Exit, straight!" She obeyed, finding the main door by the angle of light. He didn't watch her clear. He trusted the instruction and stayed with the object. This is the hardest line to hear. He did save people. Two earlier, one now by voice. But his full body returned to the box. Moral triage tilted toward leverage. At the main doors, he hit the threshold and faltered. The exterior air punched the flame toward him in a brief draw. He rolled the box forward, then followed, forearms marked in arcs where heat had seeped through the coat. Firefighters seized him, then seized the metal. He clamped his hands until an order cut through. "Let go." He did, but not before speaking the sentence that defines the profile. It can't leave this place. Not, "They're still inside." Not, "I'm hurt." The box, the boundary, the orbit. Outside, on the steps, he scanned faces. Not for gratitude, for a count. He had a mental ledger of who was in the building at dismissal. He tallied as if numbers could absolve sequence. 2 parishioners saved by touch, 1 routed by voice. Others had left earlier. He found no body unaccounted for, a relief that shouldn't soften the analysis. Seconds spent with steel are seconds stolen from possibilities you can't measure because you chose not to look. Critics will say that choice indicts him fully. Defenders will argue he made a calculated rescue and then removed a threat. The profile cuts through both. He made a control choice under heat. He believed he was protecting the many by silencing the lever the few held over him. The tragedy is that the method he chose multiplied harm before any leverage could be neutralized. He didn't intend that outcome. He authored it by sequence. So, who did he choose to save? The bodies closest to his hands. Yes. And the narrative he believed could still protect them tomorrow. He gambled the present on the future. Fire doesn't honor vows like that. It honors paths, fuel, and seconds. He left with the box because the mind inside him had already decided that custody was salvation, and the building taught him, too late, that salvation requires surrender. In the burn unit, light was clinical, and the air was heavy with humidified oxygen. He lay propped at 45 degrees, hands elevated, forearms wrapped in glossy dressings that reflected ceiling tiles like dull mirrors. The pattern told the story before he spoke. Anterior forearm arcs, wrist creases spared where cloth had bunched, palms reddened at the heel from gripping weighted steel. Contact burns, not radiant. The geometry matches lifting a hot object, not sheltering from a wall of flame. He didn't stumble into heat. He held it. Nurses charted vitals and pain scales in a rhythm that made the room feel almost orderly. An investigator stood back from the curtain line, reading the map on skin. Bandage windows showed edges feathered where heat had seeped through the funeral coat, transitioning from first to deeper second degree across a handspan. The distribution fit the timeline's last minutes. Heat was a tool he endured, not a condition he escaped. When he woke into full sentences, he didn't ask what burned. He asked, "Where is it?" The nurse said, "Secure." He pushed once more. "On site?" That's a control question, not a pastoral one. The investigator logged the words verbatim and waited for the attending to permit brief contact. Consent given, they stepped to the bed with calm voices and a recorder that clicked on without ceremony. We start benign because stress narrows cognition. "How are you feeling?" "Present." "Do you know where you are?" He named the hospital, oriented. "Can you tell us what happened after closing the church?" He answered in duty verbs. Secured doors, assisted 2 parishioners, noted smoke, initiated evacuation. The cadence was report ready, as if he could make the fire a checklist that ended in compliance. The pivot came with a single object. "You were seen exiting with a metal box." He swallowed against dryness and said, "Custody item, donations." The label tried to bend the frame. He used the noun that kept his story intact. The investigator kept the question small. "When did it enter custody?" "After evening prayer." "Which evening?" "This week." The edge of evasion showed. He blinked slow. Pain and calculation share a tempo. They asked about burns. "Your forearms show contact patterns consistent with lifting heated metal." He nodded once, a minimal concession to physics. "I used a coat." "True. Incomplete." "Why prioritize the item?" A breath, then, "It cannot leave this place." He did not say why. He did not say for whom. He placed the box inside a boundary and declared the boundary sacred. The phrase functioned like a creed he trusted to end questions. Chain of custody moved next. "The object is now in evidence. It will not return to the church." His eyes tracked the ceiling grid, then the door. Not to flee, but to gauge control points. "You will maintain logs?" "Yes." "Restricted access?" "Yes." He softened by degrees, not out of relief, but because the framework matched his language. Custody survived, even if he lost possession. We turned to the building's wounds. Photos laid on a tray showed scalloped paint near the vestry, crescent soot marks where plaques shielded wood, and a clean run along baseboards tracing the pour. He didn't flinch. He said, "That is not candle." Accurate. Disarming honesty deflects more powerfully than denial. "Do you know of any flammable liquids stored near that corridor?" "Only sacramental oils. Distillate profiles would later rule those out." His answer clung to category. "Were there recent maintenance changes?" "Hinges, camera angles, a heater in the archive after a pipe issue." He named the amplifier, not as admission, as maintenance. That's how compulsion cloaks itself, risk labeled as repair. A community liaison entered after the first round to soften edges. "People are grateful you got them out." He nodded once. Gratitude didn't land. The ledger did. "How many?" "All accounted for." A fractional exhale. Numbers calmed him more than comfort. Then the liaison relayed the other current. "Some ask why you went back." He stared at the dressing seam and answered, "Stewardship." A word like a wall. He could not climb beyond it without admitting history. The finance chair visited later, eyes rimmed in red, hand clutching a notebook like a talisman. She whispered, "They took it." He replied, "Good." That surprised her. He continued, "It won't leak." She didn't know what leak meant in his mouth. Money, secrets, or narrative? He didn't clarify. The thing is, he had translated safety into containment so fully that state custody comforted him. He believed the story could be managed if the object stayed inside a system with logs. Brands of accelerant were never said aloud in that room. Techniques were. The investigator outlined how pore lines move, how smoke layers drop, how a stairwell becomes an engine. He listened like a student who needed the exam to fit the study guide. When they asked again, "Who delivered the box?" he answered with a lattice of generalities. "A friend of the parish. A donation. No signature." Even sedated, he selected nouns that refused lineage. At discharge, still bandaged, he signed forms with a steady hand, each signature placed as if aligning a ledger. Outside, cameras waited. He didn't speak to them. He scanned the perimeter the way he scanned the nave, counting, placing, assessing flow paths. The church wore a temporary fence and a charred smell. The community wore mixed expressions, gratitude folded into doubt. He walked to a car provided by the diocese without looking back. Control moves forward. Fire had already written behind him what he could not rewrite. In statements filed that week, he admitted to safeguarding a donation and to re-entering to secure property at risk. He denied knowledge of origin. He avoided intent. The burn patterns and the bandage lines spoke where he wouldn't. They said he chose steel under heat. They said he believed custody could still absolve. They said the narrative had left his hands the moment the accelerant found the stair. Now, let's look at the mechanics of what those pages actually said once the code gave way. The cipher was simple but elegant. Liturgical anchors mapped to numbers, feast days as multipliers, psalm phrases as categories. When investigators translated the first set, the columns resolved into dates, locations, and short cues that matched parish calendar entries. A pantry drive here, a repair invoice there, a memorial stipend in between. On paper, it looked like ordinary church life. In sequence, it showed a shadow current braided through the visible stream. The first pattern was commingling. Tithe envelopes and intake bands crossed on the same line. A pantry Saturday would show a bump that exceeded recorded donations by a modest margin, then a matching "Deliver Me" note 2 days later, off-site. Not cartel-level flows, too small, too quiet, but enough to reward cooperation and punish refusal. Money didn't just enter. It learned the parish's pulse. The ledger measured that rhythm with a dealer's memory and a pastor's access. The second pattern was place. The coded locations weren't addresses. They were roles. Choir loft meant discretionary funds. Boiler room meant off-books maintenance. Side chapel meant cash kept warm for a pastoral emergency. He had built an internal map where sacred names equaled budget fictions. The more the code fit the building, the more the building became the code's keeper. That's why the sanctuary felt like a vault to him. The ledger told him it already was. Then came the mirror moves, entries that paired a charitable action with a pressure payment. Count my days, 3 beside pantry, families, 12. The numbers didn't line up as theft, they lined up as laundering of identity. He was trying to convert the posture of his past into provision for his present. If he moved a small outside band to cover a shortfall, the page recorded it as mercy in shorthand. He wasn't skimming for comfort. He was repurposing for control. Intent tried to bleach method. The page refused to lie. Photos in the box sharpened the interpretation. Angles beneath the altar rail appeared in the entries as rail left. That line corresponded to a date when a donor pledged a sudden, untraceable gift, then reappeared with a vestry 2 weeks later, marked, "Deliver me." The meaning is plain once you accept the profile. He used geography as proof of life for leverage. If they delivered, he could point to a fixed point in sacred space and say, "I know where it's at. I know where it goes next. Control is liturgy." Investigators ran the codes against bank deposits and vendor checks. Gaps emerged. Not large sums, but steady deltas that spoke to an alternate accounting system designed to make pressure survivable. The thing is, survivable isn't the same as ethical. The parish books still balanced. The method that balanced them did not. He had created a parallel stewardship where ends justified entries. That's why the ledger feels like confession without contrition. It admits facts while preserving authorship. Memory played a central role. He didn't trust banks. He trusted paper and steel. Each phrase was a trigger for recall. Measure unlocked who owed what, where, and why. Days set the cadence of compliance. This is the mind as a locked box using scripture as labels on drawers. Faith words became filing tabs. That's not piety. That's cognition weaponizing vocabulary it knows the world won't question. The decoded lines also exposed the network's fingerprints. Certain intervals, 3 days, 7 days, 12, recurred with mechanical regularity that tracked old distribution cycles. A name never appeared, but the tempo did. You don't need signatures when cadence gives you a suspect class. The ledger said, someone with rhythm access, someone who trusts schedule more than force. It fit the pressure techniques we outlined: polite coercion, deniable asks, endurance over spectacle. One entry chilled the room. Quiet hour, 1, paired to a date just before the fire. In parish life, quiet hour means prayer. In his code, it flagged a silent pickup, no receipt, no witnesses. That line, decoded, turned the box into both evidence and motive engine. It showed intention to keep the dance going, right up to the edge of the burn. Ethically, the lesson is blunt. Commingled funds contaminate meaning. Once an external band crosses the threshold, every loaf handed out carries trace. The pantry still fed people. The roof still kept out rain. But the method soaked the mercy. He believed outcomes would sanctify inputs. They didn't. They only stitched his roles together until neither held integrity under heat. The truth is worse than relapse because it's more competent. He didn't go back to selling. He fused a dealer's logistics with a priest's access and called it stewardship. The ledger isn't a fall, it's an integration map. That's why the entries feel clean to the touch and dirty in the hand. He made them tidy. The world made them harmful. What remains is meaning. The pages archive a need to decide the terms. He wrote control into the margins of ministry until the margins became the text. The fire didn't expose greed. It exposed a theology of custody, a belief that safety lives where secrets stay contained. Decoding the ledger broke that liturgy. It translated stewardship back into what it had become, management of pressure at the cost of trust. The thing is, he didn't revert. He fused. The priest didn't disappear when the dealer's habits returned. The habits were drafted into ministry. The profile shows integration, not collapse. 2 operating systems running on one machine until heat forced a reboot mid-task. Fragmentation would look like wild swings, binges, blackouts. What we see is seamless competence. Locks tightened, ledgers encoded with psalms, cash handled in bands, language framed as stewardship. That's not a fall. That's a merger. Think about functional dissociation as a sliding door, not a wall. Under ordinary stress, he kept roles in adjacent rooms, pastoral voice forward, logistics mind behind the scrim. Under pressure, the door stayed open. The dealer's precision walked into the sanctuary carrying the priest's vow. He could conduct a funeral at noon, then reset cameras at 1, then counsel a volunteer at 2 without ever announcing a shift. The compartment walls thinned, not because he lost control, but because control demanded throughput. What need did the fusion serve? Control, yes, but not for pleasure. He sought absolution through outcomes, not honesty. If the pantry stayed stocked, if the roof didn't leak, if the donor meeting produced a check, the day felt clean. In that theology, method becomes invisible if mercy lands. The profile calls that a consequentialist creed. It comforts the mind that cannot tolerate dependency. Confession relies on someone else's keys. Completion relies on your own. Here's the fatal flaw. He believed intent could sanitize method. He treated coded cache as neutral once earmarked for need. He treated surveillance photos as security work once filed as schematics. He treated a box as stewardship once labeled donation. Intent is a story we tell ourselves before physics intervenes. Fire cares about fuel and path. Trust cares about transparency. He optimized neither. He optimized custody. Integration shaped his risk tolerance. He didn't crave the old thrill, he craved clean closure. That's why he accepted immediate suspicion to preserve future leverage. In scenario A terms, carrying the box out under flame isn't bravado. It's a controlled sacrifice. Burn your arms to keep authorship. In scenario C terms, survival with the object binds you tighter but preserves agency. He would rather negotiate compromise than confess unarmed. Watch the language drift as diagnostic data. Fragmentation would scramble diction. Integration refines it. Generosity became custody. Donation became intake. Kindness yielded to policy. The nouns are containers. He packed them with both vocations until no one could tell where stewardship ended and logistics began. That's why interviews felt like policy briefings. He believed the right nouns would hold the room. Behavioral markers align. He installed redundancy like a supply chain, dual keys, 2 signatures, 2 passes on doors. He mapped choke points like distribution nodes, camera seams, blind corners, cabinet placements. He managed people as flow. Place them, point them, move them. None of it screams relapse. All of it whispers integration. When the letter with the photo arrived, he didn't seek oversight. He initiated documentation. Counter leverage is the integrated mind's prayer. The profile predicts a decisive act under strain. People who fuse roles don't resolve paradox with conversation. They attempt resets. A single event that ends the loop. Catalog, contain, carry, survive. The fire run for the box fits that prediction. He split a narrow window between incipient and growth stage, evacuated bodies, then pursued the object. Not because he loved the object, but because he believed the object's destruction or custody would settle the game. Integration promises that mastery can finish what confession would only complicate. It comes down to overconfidence in systems and underestimation of others. He trusted his infrastructure, safes, logs, routines, more than he respected adversaries' adaptability. He engineered around intrusion, ignored ignition, and assumed narrative could be managed if assets stayed in reach. The network counted on this. Pressure actors love integrated minds because they predict movement. Fragmented actors scatter. Integrated actors root. You can place a pour line where they'll be. So, where does fragmentation appear? In the body, not the plan. Burn arcs on forearms, a voice that thins when asked for dates, the stare that counts exits instead of faces. Those are micro-tears, somatic cost for cognitive cohesion. He kept the story aligned, his skin paid for it. After, he clung to chain of custody talk because it let integration persist inside an institutional frame. Evidence lockers are cathedrals for people who worship control. The final shape of the profile is spare. He is not a Jekyll and Hyde. He is a single operator using 2 toolkits to meet one need, decide the terms. That produced competence that looked saintly and decisions that read like sabotage. The sanctuary became ledger and vault. Parishioners became flows he protected. The box became sacrament and sin, an object that let both vocabularies live in his hands. Under heat, integration held until physics made a mockery of intent. Then, the door between rooms slammed. He was just a man holding steel while a building taught him what control can't do. Now let's look at the mechanics of accountability when control meets law. Criminal exposure sits in a tight cluster: fraud by commingling funds, obstruction by concealing material evidence, and potential arson liability tied to reckless endangerment if his actions amplified the burn. Prosecutors think in elements. Did he knowingly mix outside cash with parish monies? The ledger says yes in code. Did he impede investigation? The box in a church safe, moved under smoke, reads as concealment. Arson is harder. Intent to ignite isn't proven. But recklessness, stacking combustibles, concentrating records, can satisfy a lesser charge if causation holds. Institutionally, pressure pulls in the opposite direction. The parish wants to protect its image. The diocese wants cooperation that doesn't turn into scandal. Both preferences run on reputational calculus. The clean move is full transparency. Hand over books, waive privilege on building logs, welcome an outside audit. The common move is managed disclosure. Release what proves prudence. Hold what complicates narrative. Change locks. Issue statements about healing. In that gap, the truth thins. Community conflict is quieter but sharper. People held gratitude in one hand and fear in the other. They owed their exit, maybe their lives, to his competence under fire. They also saw control choices that risked them. Trust recalibrates after that. For some, trust becomes conditional. Show your process or lose our confidence. For others, trust snaps. If the shepherd hoards secrets, the flock finds a new field. Both responses are rational. Both are costly. Ethically, the core question is motive versus method. Can ends-based redemption excuse means-based harm? He framed custody as care. He believed the parish's good sanctified his tools. But ethics evaluates process, not just result. Commingling poisons, meaning even when everyone eats. Surveillance justified as security becomes coercive when it cedes leverage. Carrying the box through smoke feels like valor until you ask what other seconds could have purchased. The answer lives in risk distributed without consent. The investigative stance must avoid sentiment. Focus on motive clarity and method mapping. Establish that he didn't skim for self-enrichment, that matters for charging decisions and public understanding. Establish that he built a private control regime parallel to institutional oversight. That matters for prevention. You don't have to label him monster or martyr. You have to chart cause and effect. In law, ambiguity weakens cases. In ethics, ambiguity is the case. Consider due process. He deserves counsel, discovery, and a chance to rebut interpretations of code and conduct. The ledger speaks, but it needs corroboration. Witnesses to deliveries, chain of custody integrity, forensic ties between pour patterns and any third party. Pressure actors benefit when institutions rush. Slow, documented inquiry denies them oxygen. The profile wants control. Due process supplies a lawful version of it that serves everyone. The diocese stands at a fork. Option 1, isolate him as a rogue operator, signal zero tolerance, and cooperate fully. That protects the brand and clears space for reform. Risk, it ignores systemic incentives that made his integration plausible. Budget shortfalls, hero culture around fixers, soft oversight on cash. Option 2, acknowledge structural gaps, invite external audit, and redesign stewardship around transparency. Risk, public pain now, stronger trust later. The ethical choice is the second. Institutions rarely pick it without pressure. Community leaders can reframe charity, replace custody language with participation, publish cash handling procedures, move counting into glass rooms, literally and figuratively. Put 2 unrelated volunteers on every intake, rotate assignments, and stop treating secrecy as safety. The mind that worships control hates distributed trust because it feels like chaos. The cure looks like chaos at first, then it becomes culture. Lawyers will argue he mitigated harm by evacuating parishioners and that his intent with the box was preservation, not destruction. Prosecutors will counter that preservation for private leverage is not a protected purpose and that his actions created foreseeable risk. Both will be partly right. The judge of fact will parse timelines and burn patterns while the public parses words. Stewardship will taste different now. It should. If you're asking what justice looks like, consider proportional accountability and protective reform. Financial charges where commingling is shown. Obstruction if documentation shows intent to conceal beyond safety. Fire-related liability if causation crosses from negligence to reckless disregard. And then, separate from courtrooms, an ethical reckoning that ends lone custodian models. Replace one locked box with many open ledgers, which brings us to the last hinge. Confession versus control. He can still choose disclosure that protects others, name pressure actors, diagram routes, surrender keys, or he can continue managing narrative until sentence or silence closes the loop for him. The profile predicts he'll seek control, even now. The law will narrow his options, the community will redefine trust as transparency, and the parish will learn that safety isn't steal, it's shared light. So, what can we actually conclude without speculation? Start with ignition. Physical evidence supports a corridor origin fire accelerated by a petroleum product migrating to the stairwell and feeding on a concentrated fuel load in the basement archive. That points away from a stray candle and toward human agency. Whether that agency was the priest's hand, a third party exploiting his seams, or a blend of both, preparation by him, spark by someone else, remains an evidentiary gap. The pour pattern is clear. The igniter is not. We can also say the box functioned as both magnet and mask. Its steel kept contents dry. Its presence concentrated his choices. He lifted it under heat, which confirms priority, not intent. Preservation or erasure. The chain of custody now protects the contents from further manipulation and removes his ability to manage them. That's good procedure. It also strips him of the narrative tool he trusted most, possession. Financially, the ledger decoded into modest, steady commingling. Not profit-seeking, not lavish theft. Patterned substitutions where outside bands patched inside shortfalls and created leverage cycles. That profile fits an integration model, a logistics mind curating outcomes under a pastoral cover. It does not fit a return to open distribution. That distinction matters for charges. It narrows motive to control, not greed. On culpability, prosecutors will likely file on financial crimes, fraud, false entries, possibly conspiracy, if any exchange with pressure actors can be shown. Obstruction is plausible if his documentation or physical movements indicate concealment beyond good faith safeguarding. On fire charges, the strongest path is reckless endangerment. He created a single point of failure and amplified risk with archive consolidation and heater placement. Intentional arson requires proof he set, ordered, or knowingly facilitated ignition. The file doesn't prove that cleanly. Not yet. What we can't say is who held the match, literal or figurative. The network's presence is strongly inferred by timing, tactics, and the lettered photo. But inference is not identification. Without a witness, a device trace, or a recorded contact that links actor to accelerant, the third-party hypothesis stays persuasive but unconfirmed. Likewise, we can't say his return to the vestry was to destroy evidence. He says custody. Physics records heat, not motive. We also can't quantify harm with tidy ledgers of lives and dollars as if that settles ethics. The sanctuary will be rebuilt. Insurance will write checks with exclusions. People will return to pews that still smell faintly of ash on humid days. The psychological cost, Trust eroded, volunteer energy dampened, whispered doubt at budget meetings. Doesn't fit a restitution line. It lingers in how keys get handed over and how often people ask, "Who else knows?" Institutionally, the probable resolution looks like this. The diocese cooperates, replaces him administratively pending trial, and commissions an outside audit that publishes recommendations and a sanitized summary. The parish installs transparent cash handling, redistributes responsibility, and retires the culture that anoints the fixer. The statement released will talk about healing and accountability, and it will avoid naming the network because it can't. Not responsibly. For him, the path forks between confession and continued control. Full disclosure, names, drop points, cadence would change the risk map. It would also collapse the story he needs to live with himself. The profile predicts a curated admission, enough to appear cooperative, not enough to concede authorship of the method. Courts punish lies. They sometimes temper sentences for partial truth. Compulsion hates both because both cede the keys. What about the box's contents? We can say they connect dates, flows, and places. They implicate no celebrity, no mythic cartel, just the quiet machinery of favors and pressure. We can't say whether the photos were taken by him or delivered to him. Angle analysis suggests both sources appear. That dual origin fits the integration narrative. He documented to fight documentation. So the case closes, but only as cases close in real life, provisionally. The file will carry unresolved questions. The community will carry a recalibrated definition of stewardship, not custody, but light. The network won't vanish. It will relocate pressure where locks look new and people still believe secrecy equals safety. The best resolution is prevention elsewhere, not perfect clarity here. If you need one line to hold, take this. The fire didn't expose a monster, it exposed a method. The law will answer the rest with evidence. We stop where procedure stops and ethics begins. Months later, the sanctuary opens under fresh paint that can't quite hide a faint scorch line, a quiet seam that sunlight finds at certain hours. He sits in the last pew, hands unbandaged, not praying, counting the breaths between creaks, as if the building were a ledger he can still balance. Control survived. Absolution did not. You know the motive now. It wasn't greed. It was the need to decide the terms even as heat decided for him. He locked the box to keep his past contained. The fire proved the danger was never inside the steel. Consider this. What psychological flaw finally broke his control? The belief that intent could sanitize method or the compulsion to seek a final reset? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the criminal mind, subscribe now and watch the next case where a volunteer EMT turns evidence courier.